preparations of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. All the ways of a man are pure in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirits. Commit your works to the Lord, and your thoughts will be established. The Lord has made all for himself, yes, even the wicked for the day of doom. Everyone proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Though they join forces, none will go unpunished. In mercy and truth, atonement is provided for iniquity, and by the fear of the Lord one departs from evil. When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. Better is a little with righteousness than vast revenues without justice. A man's heart plans his ways, but the Lord directs his steps. Divination is on the lips of the king. His mouth must not transgress in judgment. Honest weights and scales are the Lord's. All the weights in the bag are his work. It is an abomination for kings to commit wickedness, for a throne is established by righteousness. Righteous lips are the delight of kings, and they love him who speaks what is right. As messengers of death is the king's wrath, but a wise man will appease it. In the light of the king's face is life, and his favor is like a cloud of the latter rain. How much better to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding is to be chosen rather than silver. The highway of the upright is to depart from evil. He who keeps his way preserves his soul. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Better to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. He who heeds the word wisely will find good, and whoever trusts in the Lord, happy is he. The wise in heart will be called prudent, and sweetness of the lips increases learning. Understanding is a wellspring of life to him who has it, but the correction of fools is folly. The heart of the wise teaches his mouth and adds learning to his lips. Pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the bones. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. The person who labors for himself, for his hungry mouth drives him on. An ungodly man digs up evil, and it is on his lips like a burning fire. A perverse man sows strife, and a whisperer separates the best of friends. A violent man entices his neighbor and leads him in a way that is not good. He winks his eye to devise perverse things. He purses his lips and brings about evil. The silver-haired head is a crown of glory, if it is found in the way of righteousness. He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. This is the inspired and inerrant word of God. May he bless its truths to our souls. You may be seated, and the children up through third grade are dismissed to their classes. We do something a little bit different as we kind of settle in. Some of the parents are taking their kids' classes a little, maybe homework assignment or an assignment for right now. So a now work assignment. If you could take a minute and look through the first 15 verses, so the first half. And if you're someone who underlines and highlights, great opportunity for you, but if you're not, then at least observe. Two things. Would you look through the first 15 verses and observe the references to the Lord, Yahweh, and then observe the references to the King, and see what you come up with as we begin. Okay, for those of you who are looking for references to the Lord and to the King, I hope that you'll see there are two different clusters of Proverbs in that section. Almost uncommonly so. Through the book of Proverbs. Verses 1 through 9 are all about Yahweh and what he thinks and what he's doing in his authority. And then verses 10 through 15 are a second section that are all about the king. 5 or 6 references there to the king all through, and it describes his deferred responsibility to lead that he has from the Lord. Those are two of the things we're going to be looking at this morning. But I do want to say a word of introduction, because I know there's some that this would be the first sermon that you're hearing in Proverbs at Grace along the way. And so just to sort of orient you as to where we're at. The first 9 chapters of Proverbs are a call to wisdom from father to son. We walked through those, and they're a little bit longer form lectures. And we heard this, that wisdom is valuable, and wisdom is to be desired more than anything else. So pursue it. Pursue even her. Wisdom is personified as a woman through those first 9 chapters. And then chapters 10 through 15 were like the first maybe semester or class of wisdom. Wisdom 101, the foundations of wisdom, beginning stuff. And he hangs everything on really 3 thematic truths. That there are 2 kinds of people in the world. There are the righteous and the wicked. And their natures, as such, are revealed by what they do. And God has a significant vested interest in establishing a proper judgment based upon the righteousness and wicked of every individual person. So we just concluded that Wisdom 101 in the last sermon on Proverbs. And now we're sort of sitting down to Wisdom 102 in chapters 16 through 22, verse 16. So as we sit down in this orientation week, wondering maybe what is going to be the leading lecture? What's most important for us to understand as we move from a very black and white, simple, foundational building blocks conversation to now something that's going to get more complicated, something that might be a little bit more nuanced. Now you're growing older. Now we understand a little bit more. Now the relationships in the world are more complex. Now our finances are more complex. Now everything is harder than it once was. So how are we to navigate that world? What's the most important thing for us to understand? What's most pressing as we begin to build on the foundation that's been laid? And the Spirit of God, by the carefully prepared words of Solomon in chapter 16, show us how to walk in light of God's authority protocol. This chapter is kind of all about authority. And we saw that in the first 15 verses, didn't we? Like you have the Lord and you have the King. If we are to live wisely, which is our stated goal in Proverbs, we're supposed to have wisdom, the skill of living righteously being developed in us by God's grace. And if we're to live wisely, then we need to understand Proverbs 16, which is the hierarchy of authority that God has built into the world. So those 2 clusters of verses immediately reveal God's leadership structure. Verses 1 through 9. Yahweh is the first one in conversation in this class. Solomon has everything to say about God's power and his sovereignty. We sing in the song Ancient of Days, of course, that's beautifully represents these ideas, that there's none above him, none before him, all of time is in his hands. For his throne it shall remain and ever stand. All the power, all the glory, I will trust in your name. For my God is the Ancient of Days. He is supreme in authority and power and establishing exactly what he desires to take place on this world. He's the maker, the establisher, the accomplisher, the decreer, the guider, the keeper, the immanent one that this entire world is about. That's what verses 1 through 9 are going to lead us into. But following that, we have verses 10 through 15, that underneath Yahweh's authority, he has established other human rulers. And any authority that any human being has is delegated to him by God. It's not inherent in who he is. It's delegated authority. And it's intended, as we'll see when we walk through that section, to pattern the righteous rule of God to the people that God has placed under them. That's their responsibility, to be God-like to the people that they're leading. There's nothing like this section in the rest of intermediate wisdom. This is the only time that we receive this concentrated a dose of conversation around either Yahweh or the king. Now, when we get to advanced wisdom, there will be a lot more kingly conversation. To a degree, the whole thing revolves around the kingly conversation because the young man who's pursuing wisdom is growing up and he's coming into leadership and he's supposed to know how a king is intended to think. But for this section, this is the most concentrated piece. There's other bits around about the Lord and about kings, but this is it. This is the primary introduction. It's very clear that God intends to prioritize our understanding of these authority structures as we begin to understand the complexities of living out wisdom in the world. If you think about it, that it makes a lot of sense that the reality is that we are people living under authorities. And to live under authorities affects the way that you live. It affects how you act. So regardless of how independent we feel or how strong we feel or how autonomous we want to be or how much, you have your own business because you didn't want to have a boss, that whole thing, it doesn't really matter whether you like being told what to do or don't like being told what to do. We have authorities. We're not the boss. There are kings that are the bosses, and then there is God who is the boss. And so it's sort of this, it's almost like a conversation with a child. They're like, oh, I don't want to do that. Well, it doesn't matter if you want to do that. You have an authority. And the more you understand the authority that God's laying out very clearly, it's like, okay, well then I need to learn how to live underneath authorities in everything that I do. That's tricky. That takes wisdom. And so he's wanting to establish our understanding of what it's going to be like for these authorities to sort of trickle down into our lives, which we have the responsibility to live wisely. So God and the king, well, what about the rest of the chapter? We could have broken this into two different pieces. We're not going to do that. Say that verses 16 through 33, all the rest of the chapter is about the pilgrim walk. So just the common person walking through life. What are we supposed to do? How are we, these wise pilgrims, supposed to live under authority? And why am I using even that word, pilgrim? We didn't hear the word pilgrim when I read it earlier. It's because of verse 17. Verses 16 and 17 are the introduction for us, now that he's established authority. 16 and 17 are the introduction for us into intermediate wisdom. So we're actually going to go in reverse order. We'll look at verses 16 through 33 and consider ourselves and three sort of necessary virtues for walking wisely under authority. And then we'll look at the authority of the king and we'll look at the authority of God himself. So the first thing that we need is how are we, the wise pilgrims, to live under authority? The first one is humbly. We're to live humbly. Now, if you remember, that was the last verse of chapter 15. His final word before we left that class was, the fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. And he sort of cast the need that we're going to have for wisdom in the next conversation and for all the conversations after that, to be humble people as we live. So, verses 16 through 19 are about the humble walk of the pilgrim. That we would be wise to accept and embrace and even rejoice in the process of being someone who's acquiring wisdom under the authority of kings and God himself. So, how much better, verse 16, to get wisdom than gold, and how much better to get understanding than silver. Verse 17, the highway of the upright is to depart from evil. He who keeps his way preserves his soul. Now, if you were here for chapters 1 through 9, then, I know it was a long time ago, but there should be all of these reminders of what was once said in those two verses. It's all of the same language. It's the same call. If we looked back to chapter 4, verses 5 through 7, we would see the dad saying something like, get wisdom, get understanding, don't forget, don't turn away from the words of my mouth, don't forsake her, she will preserve you, love her and she will keep you. Wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom, and in all you're getting, get understanding. So, the primacy of acquiring it. Then, chapter 8, verse 10, the value that he describes, gold. Receive my instruction, and not silver, and receive knowledge rather than choice gold, for wisdom is better than rubies, and all the things that one may desire cannot be compared with her. All of these things, these concepts, were previously discussed. The son was previously called into this chase, this pursuit. And that's the only reason that he sat down at the table, that he's walked into the house of wisdom and is willing to eat her fare. So he's saying this reminder as we walk into this next class. Never forget that the foundational point of why we're here is to become wise people. That's what this book is intended to do. To teach us righteous living. And living righteously, regardless of how we're feeling in the moment, he's saying it absolutely. It's better than any of the values of this world. If you could put a 1-ounce coin of wisdom, if you could get it and put it into some sort of substance and put it on the scale, and you put the billions of dollars of wealth on the other side, and you put all of your human hopes and dreams, and you put your ideal family or the ideal home or car, or anything, whatever it might be, being the best at whatever you want to be, all of that stuff, you put it on the other side of the scale, and instantly there's a massive drop on the side of wisdom. It says it weighs so much, it's so valuable that we would become people who live righteously intuitively. It's far better. It's a good reminder, a humbling one. So remember the call to the process of acquisition. And remember that takes place over time. Verse 17. This is the root metaphor of the entire book. He constantly refers back to this metaphor of the way, the walk, the path. The highway of the upright is to depart from evil. He who keeps his way preserves his soul. We are people who walk through life, and we will be characterized by the way in which we walk through life. And he's saying that the smooth path, the secure path, the way that you can know that you are safe, is to run as far away from evil as you can, to rest entirely in obedience. This is sort of this pathway that is secure, the path of salvation. He referenced this in verse 6b as well. By the fear of the Lord, one departs from evil. In relationship with God, one is taught obedience and the right desires. So this is the root metaphor, that we're pilgrims, and we're supposed to be pilgrims who love righteousness. Now, one of the things that's helpful here is that we're supposed to love the process of acquiring wisdom. Not just being wise, not just having it, but the process by which we get it. And that process is a process in which our inabilities are exposed, our need is exposed, our lack is exposed, our dependency on God is exposed. If we could learn to love the process of dependency on God and needing Him in every moment of every day, because He's the one that has the words that are sweet. And if we ever wanted to speak a sweet word, it's straight from Him. Learning to sort of love that, it's almost, well, it is counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive to our old nature, and it's not certainly what our flesh would desire. It is humbling, right? So it's journeying over time, vulnerably, asking God, requiring God by His word, by His own word to act. So it's this sort of getting comfortable, being uncomfortable. Getting comfortable going into another day, knowing that you don't know the circumstances of that day. You don't know the conversations of that day. You don't know if your plans will be rooted or you don't know if they'll be uprooted. You just don't know because you're not the boss. You're the one who's receiving from kings and receiving from the king. You're reacting constantly to different circumstances. So you get comfortable being uncomfortable. You get comfortable being dependent on God. Get comfortable with your limitations. Ultimately, we're getting comfortable trusting Him to guide us and to keep us through each day. If we could sort of acclimate to those, maybe as we could even wrongfully consider them, those harsh conditions. Like if we could acclimate to the harsh conditions of being always receiving from God and not knowing what that will be. And if we could appreciate the vulnerability and the difficulties of the process of living wise and godly lives, then we would understand and rejoice in the way that God intends for us to live. There's a reason in the Lord's Prayer, in the pattern prayer, He says something like, give us this day our daily bread, instead of just give me the ability to make bread whenever I want. He's like, no, it's more than just being wise. It's more than just having bread. It's actually learning to depend on Him for bread. Learning to depend on Him for wisdom. That's the point of Job 28. No one could get wisdom unless God opens the storehouse of heaven. So the blessed uncomfortability of humble pilgrimage far surpasses the damning comfortability of settling for earthly securities. All this stuff that makes people comfortable. Gold, that keeps you safe. That's a shield, sometimes, but not ultimately. Ultimately, wisdom, the fear of the Lord, these are great shields. So we need humility. And the picture that he paints is just this contrast in 16 through 19 of one path that is high and one path that is low. And they reflect the spirit that is inside of the arrogant, the unrighteous, the wicked person, and the humble, the lowly, the righteous person. So verses 18 and 19, pride, the high way, which is a little bit of a play on words because we have the secure way in verse 17. But the arrogant go before destruction, and the haughty spirit, the high way before a fall. And then better to be low, better to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. The arrogant, by nature, are ones who are going to deny the authority structures that God has set in place. Ultimately, His own authority. You're saying, "Nah, I don't want to listen to that. I'm not following that. He's not the boss of me." Yes, He is. And so you have this choice of one of two ways. And without saying too much about the need for humility, I might even just point you to this last Wednesday night. There's a recorded lecture on our YouTube where Pastor Matt walked through humility and what it is, what it means. That it sort of means that we are thinking soberly in this world. It means that we're acting selflessly in relation to the true needs of other people. And then most applicably here, it means that we're resting securely in the skilled and careful hand of God who is guiding our lives. We're okay with being dependent on Him. So, with humility, we accept the process. And in so doing, you'll see all these realities through 16 through 19. The humble pilgrim is enriched, and they're secure, and they're blessed. It's the better way, the better of the two paths. So that's the first thing we need. Second, we should live wisely. Wisely heeding and speaking words of satisfaction. Okay? Verse 20 through 26. It's all about words through here. And he begins by the importance of reception of God's own word. Look at 20. He who heeds the word wisely will find good. He'll find what is told. He'll find the right stuff. If you're looking for the good stuff, he says, look to the word of God. And you will find true satisfaction there. The parallel line argues the same thing. Heeding the word wisely is parallel to trusting in God Himself. We're being willing to hear from him. And then finding the good is this happiness that he establishes in wise pilgrims. So verse 20 is the primary one about the reception or being filled with the words of God. So we have it in front of us. We hear it every Sunday. We have the blessing of resources in the Word all of the time. Whenever you wanted to access it, you could. And so we ought to be drinking in the Word of God, being filled with it. And what happens in verses 21 through 26 to a person who is cared for, been filled with, been guarded by the very words of God? Well, they start spilling out of them. They're so full of them that they start talking. They're talking in ways that the God of heaven talks. And they think like the God of heaven thinks. The wise in heart are called prudent. They sort of get it. They can see life. They can see the world, even in their limitations, with the lights on. Their eyes are open. They're like, I get what God is doing, a big picture in the world. And I'm making decisions in accordance with the will of God. And this receptive heart is now producing sweet speech. The sweetness of lips increases learning. Have this understanding, and it begins to even affect the people around me. It produces satisfying water to the people around me in a way that whenever fools speak, it doesn't happen. It's just folly coming out of their mouths. But because I'm so filled with the Word of God, that when I speak, it is a blessing to the people around me. Verse 23, he's carefully taught. The heart of the wise has carefully taught, instructed his mouth, and adds learning to his lips. So mouth informed by a wise heart and guarded by God is, verse 24, sweet indeed. Pleasant words are like a honeycomb. In what way? Well, honey is sweet to the soul, so it's sort of joyful, it's refreshing, it's aesthetic, it's moral. And then it's substantive. It provides health to the bones, too. There's wisdom there. That's nourishment. There's true satisfaction. So, as we live under authority structures, we need humility, recognizing and even just embracing our limitations, the process by which God has called us to acquire wisdom, day by day, dependent on Him. And then we need this wise desire to be filled with what God has said, so that then what God has said comes out of her mouth in a very sweet and satisfying way. Lest you think that someone that could escape this authority structure and be sort of wise in your own eyes and your own boss. 25 and 26 is a little reminder before we get to the final point that you don't know enough to be truly wise on your own. You evaluate a path, and you think that it looks straight, you think that it looks right, and it isn't. The end of that way is death. This is an exact quote of chapter 14, verse 12. It says, in order to sort of demonstrate that, let me just even remind you, all of you, entrepreneurs, it's your own business, no boss, right? Well, your boss is your stomach. It's like you're not even the boss of you. Your stomach is the boss of you. You're doing that so you can take food home because you're still needy. You're still dependent. So you can't get away from the concept that you're a dependent individual. The person who labors is just laboring for himself because he needs to eat. The master is mastered. So we need humility. We need wise words coming into us so that they could then come out of us. And then finally, we need the fear of God, which is the departure from evil. So obedience. And you just look at this character sketch. It's very similar. If you're jotting down like a reference, you could jot down chapter 6, verses 12 through 19. We saw something very similar there in the prologue. But just shows all sorts of different kinds of ungodly people. The ungodly man, he's digging up evil. There's somebody who's finding faults and spreading faults around, and it's as though he's just carrying around this flamethrower out of his mouth and burning people who are around him because that's his desire, to just dig up evil. And then there's someone who goes and he's planting seeds of discord and disunity, and he's breaking apart people who once were together by his whispering. In verse 29, there's people who are out there calling others to join them in their wickedness. It's a lot like the evil male voice in chapters 1 through 9, the leader of the gang who's enticing people, enticing his neighbor, enticing his nephew, enticing his friend, and leading him in a way that's not good. He's leading him, again, there's the way, this foundational metaphor. And then there's body language that goes along with it in 30, winking the eyes and pursing their lips and all these tricky body language that shows their hearts, that shows who they are and what they're doing. So, interestingly, if you look at all of those, and then you think about, okay, well, what am I supposed to do with that? One, avoid this, avoid being it, avoid spending, we'll get to this point, but avoid spending time with people who are qualified or who are characterized in this way. And then if you look through them, every single one of these, we're called to the opposite of those things. We're called, like if you go back to verse 27 and walk through one more time, we're called to cover offenses. Like love covers a multitude of offenses. Not to unearth them and bring them up all over the place. We're called, he just read, like that we have lips that are like honey in verse 24. Not lips that are like breathing fire. Verse 28. Aren't we called to sow unity, sow seeds of righteousness which bear fruit? Are we supposed to provoke other people, like verse 29, the opposite of verse 29, provoke other people to good and to lead them in that way, to live a life that's followable? We're called to the opposite of these. So we would do well sort of get used to the concept as a pilgrim of being someone who is departing, being someone who's you'll round a corner 1,000 times in the day in your mind or with your feet, and you see this opportunity before you that is ungodly, and perhaps it's enticing, perhaps your flesh is calling to you, perhaps it's alluring, and we should be in the habit of about facing around that corner, remembering the words of God because we're heeding them and we're trusting in the Lord and we're blessed in so doing. And what's coming out of our mouth and our hands and our feet is all goodness. It's all righteousness. That's the ideal picture that's painted here. So we should be used to turning from the world, whether it's outside or the flesh that's inside. It's a habit of seeking to walk in the fear of the Lord, departing from evil. It's mentioned 3 times throughout this chapter alone. So we need humility to live under authority, we need wise words to live under authority, and we need the fear of God. This little conclusion at the end is, I think, a pilgrim, right? He's been walking on the way now for a very long time. Verse 31, the silver-haired head is the crown of glory. He says, as someone has walked in this way for a very long time, they'll be aged in wisdom. And it will be reflected on their head. It will be reflected with gray hair. And blessed are those who have walked the way of wisdom for such a long time that they've grown wise gray hairs. It prompts in them even something that's better than this next generation that's rising up, that's so strong and so ambitious and so after conquering the world, but he's learned patience, self-control, he's slow to anger. Verse 32 says, that's better than this generation that rises up with physical strength. He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty. He who rules the spirit than he who takes a city. We'll get to verse 33 in the beginning where we talk about God himself as the supreme ruler. But maybe you can jot down one other thing if you want an assignment or a muse for the week. Next to verse 32, so he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules the spirit than he who takes a city. Write down James 1, 16 through 27. And all 3 things, let me just read this verse so you kind of know what you would be looking for. So in James 1, he's actually talking about the word of truth. And then he says, so my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Those 3 things. All 3 of those, swift to hear, is like verse 20. Slow to speak is like verses 21 through 24. Slow to wrath is explicitly described in verse 32. And then he goes on in James to continue talking about the word of truth. So the question that I would be interested, if you want to wrestle with this a little bit, is connecting, how is James 1 related to something like Proverbs 16? And how is it that the word of God, which is a theme in both of these texts, is related to our mouth and our anger? Does that make sense? Like to sort of bring together those ideas. How is the word of God and how we're speaking, how we're responding, how are all three of those related to each other? Proverbs 16, James 1. Okay, so that's our responsibility. Humility, wise words, fear the Lord. Let's look at the king. Let's turn to consider these authority structures, what they're so busy with, and how that might prompt or encourage or guide us into humility, wisdom, and fear. I'm just going to reread verses 10 through 15 and notice them in pairs. So divination is on the lips of the king. His mouth must not transgress in judgment. Honest weights and scales are the Lord's. All the weights in the bag are his work. That's the first pair. Then it's an abomination for kings to commit wickedness, for a throne is established by righteousness. Righteous lips are the delight of kings, and they love him who speaks what is right. Final pair. As messengers of death is the king's wrath, but a wise man will appease it. And the light of the king's face is life, and his favor is like a cloud of the latter rain. Okay, well, this is exactly what all governments look like anyways, right? This is what kings do all the time. They just live well, they're so righteous, they're living out exactly how God would have them to live out. No, this is certainly an ideal, right? This is what God intends. This is what governments are intended to be doing. I don't know that there's a single one that's really doing it. But this is what kings should be about. They should be about the words and the ways of God, because their responsibility has been given to them by him. They've been appointed to this task of leading other people. And as someone who holds delegated authority, knowing the desires of the one who has delegated the authority to you is incredibly significant. So first we see in verses 10 through 12 that the kings are intended, the government even, is intended to mediate for God socially. That when the king speaks, he has authority in his voice. And that's significant. So then he should be very careful what he says. He should put a lock and key on his mouth and only unlock it when he knows that he's not transgressing the judgment of Almighty God. He has a responsibility to human courts, to the justice system of God, and to human economy in verse 11. That these things, honest weights and scales, came from somewhere. Did you know math came from somewhere? And the reason we have it is so that we could be fair, we could be equitable, we could be just. These things belong to God. He's designed and delegated them, and now the king is responsible to hold them with righteousness. So these social interactions in the courts and in the economy, governments ought to know the words and the ways of God. I might say as we go through this too, while the very clear attention is on the king. These kings, he's not only talking about like the one guy that's crowned in an area, like in a country. He's talking about leadership. He's talking about the rulers of the world, those who have people underneath them. So in other places, he'll reference them as princes. In other places, he'll just reference them as rulers. He's really talking about the same concept. So I know we're a bit downstream, but it's probably good for us, yes, to sort of be processing this from a governmental perspective and like ultimately looking at the many ways probably that our own and other governments fail abysmally here, but also that we should think of other downstream leadership opportunities, even that we may be placed in, because that's what advanced wisdom is going to do. It's going to train us up to be leaders in our own circles. So dads be thinking about the family, parents be thinking about the children, those who are at work with people under you, maybe be thinking about how you lead in those areas. This all has a trickle-down effect into how we act in all areas of leadership. So you might say, hey, someone who's a boss, someone who's leading, it's important what they say because the people under them are listening to what they have to say. So may our mouth not transgress in judgment. It would be fair and honest, not skew the weight system. Fair in our economy too, not take advantage of others. The second point, so the king has responsibility to social mediation. Then he has a responsibility to be moral in his character. That's verses 12 and 13. It's an abomination for kings, for leaders, for fathers to commit wickedness. Because the throne, the business, the family, these places are established. They're grown, they're grounded in righteousness. That's how God desires to establish a strong society, and how he will establish a strong society is by letting righteousness flow everywhere. And so it would be right for us then to pattern our lives righteously, to be moral in our character, to be shaped by a book like this one. And so speak and so do the will of God. Righteous lips are the delight of kings, verse 13, and they love him who speaks what is right. So in his activity, out and about, and in his words, it's important for the leadership to be moral in their character. We might say, as Paul said, like, follow me as I follow Christ, something that's patternable. He tells even Timothy that his pattern of life would be shown to be Christ-like. The third piece that a king is responsible to do in verses 14 and 15, or it's actually not his responsibility demonstrated there, it's just a reality of kingship. And it shows how much sort of power that the king has. You look at this guy, it's like, well, if he's upset, somebody might die. And if he's happy, then somebody lives. And if you're on the receiving end of that, if the king's mad at you, it might be you that's in the crosshairs. And there's sort of this intrinsic power to the position that God has given to him. And I'm thankful in verses 14 that it doesn't then say, so you should trust the king. Trust in him. Trust in the government. Trust in anyone that's above you, humanly speaking. He doesn't say that. He actually says, be wise. Play the game wisely. Appease them. Know how you should respond so that if it be God's will, even his wrath might be abated and you could dodge a bullet. There will be a lot more conversation about this through both intermediate and certainly then in advance, how we're supposed to interact with leadership and finding their favor and what's permissible, what's ethical, and what's not. So we'll leave some of that on the table. But there's this power that they have to grant favor and to frown. So finally, we need to look at the one that are above, the one that's above the kings, which is so good for us to have. Ecclesiastes references this, that like you can go through all the red tape of human leadership and you might get to the very top and still find injustice. But there is one to whom the greatest kings are still responsible. And there, the poor will find their justice. And that's in God himself. And so let's look at two principles here as we bring this to a close. Two principles in verses 1 through 9. And one of them is probably the theme of the chapter, and that's this first one. That God establishes the words and the ways of men. It's another way of saying he's sovereign, that he's in control, that there is one king, and it's him. He says in verse 16, for example, we'll read three different verses, 16:1, and then verse 9 and verse 33. The preparations of the heart belong to the man. So here we go, working, laboring, wagering, preparing, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. Verse 9, a man's heart is He's there diligently doing what? He's planning his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Verse 33. Here's humans making decisions. The lot is cast into the lap, but every decision that the lot gives is from the Lord. So what he's arguing here is for a sovereign God, for a God that does everything that he desires in this world, that accomplishes everything he intends to in this world. And that doesn't mean, because we have a supreme authority, that doesn't mean we just say, so the way I live doesn't matter because he's going to do whatever he wants to do. No. The preparations of the heart belong to man. We have this responsibility to go ahead and live, to go ahead and seek to raise our children in the fear of the Lord, to go ahead and seek to live healthy lives, to take care of our bodies, to learn about the human body and to live well, live wisely, to go ahead and look for the spouse and commit to your spouse, and then to be wise with our finances. And so we maybe do the budget and we think through how we're spending the things that God has given to us and the way that we're giving to take care of others. And we take care even of our own hearts, and we're responsible to keep them and to guard them. Like our own spiritual flourishing is in this one degree, like you're responsible for it. That you are intended to prepare your heart and live, to go live well. But as you're planning and as you're preparing, whether it's the events of a day or the events of your life or whatever it might be, just remember that anything that ultimately happens because God has established it to happen. So there's this big gap between your preparation and anything that actually takes place. And God himself stands in that gap as the authority. So when you're frustrated by the fact that your plans didn't work and by maybe how your children are growing up and what they are committing to or not committing to, or how your health is going, or the frustrations of not being able to accomplish this or that in your own body, or you've worked so hard and you've eaten so well and you've done all these things and now you get this terminal disease, or maybe you've carefully prepared and you've done these financial things but stuff keeps coming up that's costing all this money, and what in the world, I thought I was supposed to plan and be wise and I would be blessed, and now we're remembering, oh right, we need humility along this way because we're not the boss. We need humility because God's the one that establishes our steps, and to live in front of him with wisdom is incredibly vulnerable. It's like every day, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, and blessed be the name of the Lord. Even in like verse 1 reminded me of the sermon process. Here we go, laboring through the week. There you go, planning on how to reconcile with somebody. Here you go into a big meeting, planning what you're supposed to say. Good, plan, you should. Plan what to say here. But when you speak, know that anything wise you say has come directly from God. He establishes the words of your mouth. Plan your way, verse 9. But when you step, know that God is the one who's establishing your steps. He's deeply involved in our lives. He's all-knowing and all-able. He's so deeply involved that he gets down to the very detail in verse 33 of the decision of essentially the dice. Every time you roll the dice, every time you flip the coin, what happens there is God's decision. He's not saying go do that. He's not saying make your decisions that way. He's saying everything that happens has passed by the divine throne, and he's establishing it. So don't imagine that you're in control. That's what we need to understand as things get a little bit more complicated. Don't imagine that you're in control. Trust him. That's what he says in verse 3. Commit your works to the Lord. There's so much more that we could say here. But the second point about God is that God receives glory in all of the decisions that he makes. So every time he's moving every one of our and the global churches and even the feet of the wicked, as he moves and establishes and preserves and directs, as he does all these things, he receives glory. So look at verses 4 through 8. And I like to encourage you to see the gospel, even in a book like Proverbs, particularly verse 6. But just notice the flow of this thought. So God made everything. He's the great maker. He's made all of it for himself. He is the one who will receive glory. He is the one who established the story. He's the one about whom the story is told. He's made everything for himself. Even the wicked for the day of evil, even the day of judgment is something that he's doing for his glory. And so then he gives sort of a verse about them. Yeah, look at all the proud in heart, all these people who chose the high road, who chose autonomy, who chose, I don't want to submit under the authority of God. I don't want to live a wise life. Everyone proud in heart is an abomination to Yahweh. And even if all of them got together and fought against him, and they will, none will go unpunished. So then, how are we any different from that? Because that's our story. That was our origin. We were born in sin. And there's the gospel in verse 6. He says, in mercy and in truth, atonement is provided for iniquity. If you just quoted that verse to anybody, no one would ever guess that that was from the book of Proverbs. Say, in mercy and in truth, atonement is provided for iniquity. And then he starts talking about the people who've received the covenant love and the faithfulness, which is what mercy and truth are talking about. The covenant love and the faithfulness of God are those who fear the Lord. By the fear of the Lord, one departs from evil. And we could tell that story, and we will, right here, is that how is it that God has provided atonement for iniquity by his covenant love and his faithfulness? And it's simply this, that in his great love, he sent his Son to die for sinners who were opposed to him. He sent his Son to die for those who were proud in heart and who were an abomination to him. And in the substitutionary sacrifice of Jesus, he caused all of those who once walked against him, whom he has delighted in, as is demonstrated in verse 6, 1 through 9, who he has sovereignly delighted to establish their steps toward him, to pour out the curse they deserved on Jesus, to pour the righteousness of Jesus onto them. All of those who have tasted and seen that the Lord is good, all of those who fear the Lord, who have been moved from relationship only with God as a creation and the creator, to now those who have been moved into relationship as a son to a father. That transaction, that gospel, that good news, that redemption story, that's how he's now making people who are wise. That's now how he's making people on whom his favor could be shown. And that's exactly what he says in the next verse. And by the way, when a man's ways please the Lord, why? Because there's some people that are out there living in a way that pleases the Lord? No, because God makes people who by nature please him. When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. So verse 5 is all about the judgment of God on those who are against him. Verse 7 is all about the favor of God on those who fear him. And verse 6 explains how he does it. It's by his covenant love and his faithfulness. He's atoned for their sin. And so we're left with this idea in verse 8. So how then should we live now in relationship to the nature and the timing of all of God's rewards? Because if we're in him, we're with him, and it's joyful, and we have everything. So, well, yeah, one day we'll have full reward. For today, maybe say it this way: better is a little with righteousness than having everything without justice. So I think in the context of the conversation about who God is and what he's doing, it's really our willingness to live in faith. Our willingness to live humbly, wisely, with the fear of the Lord, that we would say, you know what, this life is the blessed life. So even though we begin to process the sovereignty of God as like preparation for difficulty, we're like, okay, so even when I make a good plan, it's probably going to get ruined because God's not going to let me do it. Think instead like, okay, wow, what do I actually deserve? Where would all my plans lead me? God has very graciously
sovereignly, mercifully guiding us to good paths. So stop thinking that you have the good idea and God has the corrective idea. Your ideas lead to death. But God's ideas, God establishes the steps of his people to life. So may we learn, as we begin this more complicated process, that it's good for us to be led. It's good for us to follow. It's good for us to be weak and to not know very much and to be dependent upon him, because he is strong